This episode of the podcast is brought to you by New Bloom Labs. New Bloom Labs tests plant material for potency monitoring, full panel analysis, and official state compliance testing. The company has locations in Tennessee and Texas, and more to come soon. They test intermediate manufacturing materials such as crude, isolate, distillate, etc. They also test final consumer products, edibles, topicals, beverages, cartridges, pre-rolls, keef, you name it. And did I mention that they always provide a next business day turnaround on potency tests? That's right, 1 to 2 business day turnaround on terpene profiles and screenings for heavy metals, pesticides, residual solvents, and mycotoxins. They have the best analysis of Delta 8 THC material in the industry. Superior science, rapid results, that's New Bloom Labs.
Hello everyone, Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Dr. Stuart Titus, CEO of Medical Marijuana Inc. Dr. Stuart Titus, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for asking, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm excited to get some insights from you today.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on. I thank you so very kindly for the opportunity.
Yes, of course. And for those listening, as I mentioned, I have Dr. Stuart Titus on. He's the CEO of Medical Marijuana Inc., which was the first ever publicly traded cannabis company in the U.S. that launched the world's first ever cannabis-derived nutraceutical products, brands, and supply chain. So I know that's the boiler point. And Dr. Stuart, we want to get into more about the company and your leadership as CEO. But first, let's allow the audience to get to know a little bit about your background. So from what I've read, I know that you initially started off in Wall Street, right, on the financial side.
Yes, I was in the financial markets for 11 years. I worked on Wall Street, most of my career with Credit Suisse, First Boston, a big investment banking firm. I was a bond trader and underwriter.
Okay, and so that's a whole different pace, I would imagine. Wall Street, New York City, it's go, go, go. And so now the cannabis industry still, of course, go, 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 because, you know, we're scratching the surface at this industry that's about to explode, but a little different kind of culture, right? So what made you make the transition, and how was that process?
Well, it's certainly an interesting process, but after 11 years on Wall Street, like you mentioned, the fast-paced lifestyle, the volatility of the markets, the trading, et cetera, I just had enough, and enough was enough. Wound up leaving the financial industry and actually had a very interesting career as a PhD physiotherapist. I wound up studying physiotherapy, and over time with my clinical practices and experience working with the individuals, I wound up with a PhD degree in the field of what's called British physiotherapeutics. I specialized in a low-level form of electrical stimulation. Interestingly enough, it was done quite extensively at that time among professional sport and Olympic athletes. And when they were with their teams on season, they would get this therapy on a very regular basis. It helped them to recover from injuries, help them decrease pain, just help relax the body a little bit, and certainly was quite well used with these athletes on season with their sport teams. I was one of a handful of people doing this for the general public. And of course, in the off season, a lot of these athletes would come through to my office. And here, it was so interesting. A lot of the contact sport athletes were using cannabis, even though they were risking their careers, but they would rather get cannabis versus the traditional pain meds, the opioids or whatever, because they wouldn't have the opioid hangover the next day. And certainly many were seeing great benefit in terms of pain reduction, the ability to sleep, and reducing inflammation as well. So this piqued my interest to the point that I searched and found there were occasional medical cannabis symposiums. There's doctor meetings, gatherings with all these clinicians who would get together and share, study, and research on cannabis and the extracts from cannabis, particularly the cannabinoids.
And what time period is that? What year was that when these doctors were getting together and talking about cannabis? when it comes
Well,
to athletic recovery?
yes, it was very interesting to see the evolution of this. It really started in the late 1990s, particularly with the evolution of the internal endogenous cannabinoid system. And that had been discovered back in 1988 by researchers at St. Louis University Medical Center, Drs. William Devane and Dr. Alan Howlett. Of course, they don't get all the notoriety that they probably should. Certainly, many great individuals in the world have done some wonderful things. Dr. Raphael McCoolum, for example, determining the chemical structure of the THC molecule dating back to 1964. Individuals like Dr. Ethan Russo and his tremendous work on clinical endocannabinoid deficiency starting in the late 1990s. But certainly this was something of great interest to me, that these symposiums were going on. So about 2004, I think I did my first medical cannabis symposium.
Got you. And so this is a perfect kind of kickoff to our conversation, right? Because there's this hyper focus today, especially with, you know, the pandemic that we're currently living through, and on the political landscape, with this emphasis of science, right? And you know, there's so much information out there when it comes to health and our anatomy and our biology, but there's very little information regarding the endocannabinoid system, right? And you mentioned the founders, and I think you said the year was 1969. Is that right?
In 1964, Dr. McCoolum was credited with the discovery of the THC molecule, the psychoactive component, of course, of marijuana forms of cannabis. And certainly this had tremendous repercussion. Being in Israel, he had the ability to study cannabis, where a lot of research in other countries, particularly here in the US, have been very much quashed because of its Schedule 1 regulation by our authorities who do such things. But anyway, the fact that these research studies were allowed to take place was tremendous. And actually, prior to Dr. McCoolum, it was very, very interesting to note that in 1940, a researcher in the US, Dr. Roger Adams, even though cannabis was under prohibition at that period in time, on the research side of the US government, there was still funding for some study and research on cannabis, because formerly it had been medicine in the US pharmacopoeia, et cetera. So in 1940, Dr. Adams actually isolated and discovered the molecule cannabidiol, CBD. And this led to a US government patent. I believe it was awarded in December of 1942 on the isolation of cannabidiol.
So, okay, so this is all interesting. This is really good history for not only myself, but of course the listeners. And so, as we're talking about, let's give the listeners a high level overview of our endocannabinoid system and how these endocannabinoid receptors, you know, help regulate things like mood and sleep and appetite, and especially when they're married with cannabinoids, as you mentioned, like CBD and THC and others.
Well, it's been tremendous to see the growing amount of research over the years. I believe I testified at the FDA last year, May of 2019, on CBD. And in my testimony, I mentioned that now at our National Institutes of Health, there are over 10,000 articles that have mentioned this internal endogenous cannabinoid system. So certainly there's a tremendous amount of research going on, and we're learning more and more every day. Basically, the initial research found this amazing receptor site in the brain, the CB1 receptor. And this is accepting of cannabinoids, and particularly the THC molecule, which has a more direct lock and key type effect. And this gives you the psychoactivity or the high type effect that can be felt from cannabis. And certainly, it's been interesting to note that over time, the research has shown that this CB1 receptor is the most widely expressed of all the brain's neurotransmitter receptor sites. So we have more receptors for cannabinoids than any other molecule or compound, or these other things that influence the say the serotonin receptor site or the opioid receptor sites, or just what have you. So with the advent of the CB1 receptor, mostly expressed again the brain, the spinal column, the central nervous system, this relates more to the neurological side. And cannabinoids have been shown to have tremendous neuroprotective and possibly even neuroregenerative type capabilities. So there's some very interesting anti-aging research going on in that arena. And then the CB2 receptor was discovered in the mid-1990s. And this really exists more in the gut, the viscera, the internal organs of the body, and helps the body to relate more to immune function. And so the antioxidant or anti-inflammatory benefits of cannabinoids can be better expressed through the CB2 receptor, potentially, and certainly we're excited about the fact that now there's a emerging concept of the CB3 receptor, which is very technically what's called a G protein coupled receptor site in the brain, the GPR55 as it's known. The great cannabis researcher, Dr. Orrin Deficiency from New York University Hospital, did all the study on the pharmaceutically developed version of CBD, Epidiolex. Basically, Dr. Deficiency credits CBD's action on this particular brain receptor site, this GPR55 receptor, as the reason why the seizure episodes are coming down so nicely in these young children with epilepsy. And of course, over time, there's been a great amount of work done. And it turns out that our own human bodies, we naturally produce our own internal endogenous cannabinoids. And
well, I'm glad you brought that up. Just sorry to pause you, but when you mentioned that we produce our own endogenous endocannabinoids, like I've read that when you hear the term a natural runner's high, right? If you've been running for a certain period of time and you get to that point where you're feeling that runner's high, that's basically a similar feeling as if you were to smoke THC. Is that correct?
Well, in a way, it is, yes. This internal, the internal cannabinoids that the human body produces, unfortunately, are very quickly degraded by normal enzymes and enzymatic processes. So, we produce cannabinoids. They might only last mere seconds in the body, maybe a minute or so if we're lucky. But it's when we're doing extreme things, such as extreme exercise and running, say, a marathon, all of a sudden after 16 miles or so, oh, this beautiful bliss-like feeling overcomes many of us. And yes, this is where the body's internal production of cannabinoids overcomes the tendency for enzymes to degrade it, and the release of this internal cannabinoid called anandamide, as Dr. McCollum from Israel had found this amazing internal cannabinoid, and he so named it because anandamide in Sanskrit means the bliss chemical. And so this release of anandamide throughout the body then gives you this beautiful runner's high type feeling.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that mothers, of course, when they're pregnant, the body chemistry changes. And here, the production of another internal cannabinoid, 2-AG, again overcomes the tendency for enzymes to degrade it. And thus, the first food the mother feeds to the child in the breast milk is well expressed in cannabinoids.
Wow. And I've heard you talk about that. Obviously, with the federal regulation, there's been an emergence of people becoming deficient with these compounds, right? These cannabinoids that we're inherently biologically married to the plant, right? And so what is that doing to us in the long term by if we're depraving our bodies of these cannabinoids?
Well, it's been very interesting to see that, of course, again, the enzymes tend to degrade the internal cannabinoids, and thus we need to supplement with plant-based cannabinoids. And these are essential and vital nutrients that support our higher levels of health and wellness. Dr. Ethan Russo, I mentioned earlier, used to be the head medical director of GW Pharmaceuticals, a group who's now got the FDA approval on Epidiolex, but Dr. Russo's research, and he was a trained neurologist and worked with many patients clinically, and was finding in the late 1990s, early 2000s, many were coming into his office with some very difficult to treat medical conditions, things such as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, certain types of migraine headache. And through his research, Dr. Rousseau found that they were all very deficient in their normal cannabinoid levels that were circulating through the blood. And basically, once he got his patients on a more plant-based cannabinoid routine, that all of a sudden a lot of these individuals started to overcome their challenges. And so he wrote a wonderful paper called Clinical Endocannabinoid Deficiency. And certainly over the years, this has really come into much more significance and prominence, not only because of the great amount of additional research done on those particular conditions, but also research at a group, say Stanford University, and I believe it was April of 2017, found that the early onset of Alzheimer's dementia is brought about by an internal endogenous cannabinoid deficiency.
Wow. Wow.
Digestive tract by a Dr. McCormick, I believe it is Beth McCormick at University of Massachusetts, has mentioned that the internal lining of the gut is made up of cannabinoids. And many people who have these inflammatory gut-related type diseases, inflammatory bowel syndrome, et cetera, tend to have a deficiency of cannabinoids. They can't properly line the gut, and here the body keeps attacking itself until one gets sufficient cannabinoids to where they can line the gut. Then the body's response dampens, and people overcome some digestive challenges. So she's written a very nice series of papers on the endocannabinoid deficiency affecting the digestive system as well. So there are a plethora of conditions that seem to be falling into this category of clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, and certainly this is an emerging target in the field of medicine.
Sure. In addition to digestive issues that these reports, like you mentioned, Dr. Russo, the University of Massachusetts, and even Stanford, that they're doing these things and they're finding these results and they're positive. Would you say that there's been any other, like, have there been any drawbacks, right? So from what I've heard so far, there's a lot of science and research and reports and findings that back what you're saying, right? When you're approaching, governmental bodies like the FDA, like, what's their response to this stuff? I mean, it's like, they're obviously taking it into consideration, but do they have findings that are different? And here's my last point to this question is, to play devil's advocate, I've heard that there are some common myths when it comes to smoking too much THC. Like, one is memory loss, the other is having no dreams, or smoking THC flowers lowers your fertility. So are those things, is there any truth to those, as well as to what is the FDA's perspective?
Well, it's been interesting to see for years and years now, cannabis being considered a narcotic compound, and all forms of cannabis kind of fitting into this category, and thus the study and research being done by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they've been funding a lot of study and research, has been mostly targeted towards the negative effects of cannabis. It's been unfortunate that, because of the Schedule I stigma, if you will, that we haven't been able to do enough human study with natural forms of cannabis, the botanical forms. Certainly, going back to 1986, I believe it was, a synthetic form of THC was actually US FDA approved, Marinol, and it's been past a 20-year patent cycle, and now there's a generic version called dronabinol. But then again, this is a synthetic laboratory developed form of THC that has a very similar chemical structure to the natural THC we get from plants. However, the human body is smart, and it recognizes the natural botanical form to a much higher degree than the pharmaceutically developed form, which many patients who have taken the synthetic form of THC, which is mostly for post-chemotherapy, nausea and vomiting, obviously have a very weakened patient population, and then they take this particular drug. Well, of course, the drug form, the pharmaceutical form of THC will have some toxic side effects, particularly liver enzymes get very elevated, very, very toxic liver enzymes that can cause tremendous side effects, even death in some individuals. So these synthetic forms of cannabis are really, in many ways, much more dangerous. In fact, you look at people who take the synthetic forms of THC, your spice, K2. I mean, there have been a number of deaths actually from it. But it's interesting to note, no one's ever died from an overdose of natural botanical cannabis. Your receptor sites are in a different part of the brain than, say, your opioid receptors, which can, have a unfortunate detrimental effect on the body's autonomic breathing reflex. And people who overdose on opioids just forget to breathe and die of asphyxiation, interestingly enough. But that doesn't happen with cannabis.
Right. And when you put it that way, it's like, I mean, it's obvious that cannabis legalization and everything that goes into it over the past 70 plus years, it's a very complex issue at this point. We've made it very complex. But when you talk about it in that way, like, we're almost chasing our own tail by the government developing synthetic cannabinoids to measure the efficacy of the cannabinoids, and how they work on the human body. Yet it's not apples to apples because, like you said before, our biology, the human body reacts differently to something that's botanical as opposed to something that's man-made and created in a lab, right? And so are they considering that in their findings? Like, are they saying, like, kind of like an asterisk or a footnote that says, well, these results are not as accurate because they're synthetic?
Well, it's very interesting. Of course, it's very difficult to standardize a plant. I mean, you have the cannabis plant, you have 500, maybe 1,000 different chemical compounds. Of course, there's a THC, or if it's a marijuana form of cannabis, it's grown for a high concentration of THC, but you also have all these other cannabinoids in minor proportions. Some of them have a little bit higher concentration of CBD. If it's a hemp plant, it's got a higher CBD concentration, lower THC, but you've got, again, trace cannabinoids, you've got terpenes, flavonoids, all kind of plant material, plant waxes, chlorophyll, etc. And certainly it's very difficult to repeat consistent level of 500 or 1,000 different cannabinoids. So to standardize some of this, of course, the pharmaceutical company just takes one or two active ingredients, and that's their formulation, and certainly you'll get an effect. But of course, when you're missing the full spectrum, this entourage effect, if you will, then you see with Epidiolex, for example, the FDA-approved version of CBD. Well, these very young children are taking between 400 and 700 milligrams worth of CBD daily. I mean, if they were adults, they'd probably be taking 2,000 plus milligrams of CBD daily to control their seizures. But, with a natural botanical form, maybe 1/10 of that will certainly have a tremendous effect for some individuals, and many respond better to the botanical form than they will to the pharmaceutically developed form. Again, it's just, the natural plant materials all coming together and working in this wonderful full spectrum version.
Right. Yeah, I have heard that echoed on the podcast. Adam Jocks was on, and he was saying that he basically gave the analogy. It's like you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you're not going full spectrum, right? And you're just going isolate with, say, just CBD or just THC. You're not getting that entourage effect, which is very important. But going back to my one question, and this is curious just for my own benefit. So, I mean, is there studies that prove that smoking THC, like for instance, lowers fertility? Like growing up, the bro science was like, oh, you don't smoke the seeds and stems, it'll make you less fertile. But is there any truth to that?
Well, certainly there's been study and research that looks towards the negative side of things, but it's very interesting to see that the reproductive tract is very well lined with cannabinoid receptors. And for many individuals, it's just a question of getting a good balance between, say, THC, CBD, and all these other, up and coming minor cannabinoids. So I personally would believe if someone's a THC user, well, they're probably doing some great things for their overall health and wellness just by the recreational use of cannabis, because again, you have tremendous anti-inflammatory properties. You have tremendous neuroprotective properties for your brain cells. And certainly this has a great effect throughout the body. And if you're a regular THC user, I might encourage you to try to use maybe a little bit more CBD just to balance things out in the brain, and vice versa. Many people are very strong CBD users. Well, a little bit of THC every so often certainly helps them to find this wonderful balance of the homeostasis that this internal endogenous cannabinoid system is really trying to bring to the human body.
Got you. Okay, and you touched on minor cannabinoids, so let's talk about those. Let's talk about CBN, for instance. I know that there's been a lot of recent studies that talk about this cannabinoid as being very beneficial when it comes to a sleep aid, right? So what are your thoughts on CBN and even other cannabinoids like CBG and CBC?
We certainly are now able to grow a high enough concentration of some of these minor cannabinoids to where they can actually be commercialized. And I'm quite excited about the up and coming aspect of some of these newly discovered or newly available forms of cannabis. CBN has been shown in some studies to have potential sedating effects. In fact, it may be the most sedative of all the cannabinoids. Many anecdotally help use it to help them with sleep issues. Certainly it does also seem to hit certain pain receptors that are part of this internal endogenous cannabinoid system, and help to calm, decrease some of the anxiety in the central nervous system, just helping the body to relax and to be able to handle pain to a much better degree. But certainly it does seem that many people are using CBN as a sleep aid, if you will, and we look forward to exploring some of the potential pharmaceutical opportunities that we gather from all this anecdotal evidence. CBG, another up-and-coming cannabinoid that you mentioned, is really the stem cell cannabinoid. It's the first cannabinoid that the cannabis plant develops as it starts to mature. And if it's a marijuana plant, marijuana form of cannabis, certain enzymes may convert that CBG over to THC in its acid form, and then of course when it gets decarboxylated, that turns into the active form of THC that gives you the psychoactivity. If it's a hemp plant, that CBG will then be converted by other enzymes over into CBD. So certainly CBG, the stem cell cannabinoid, what happens if you put it in the human body? Well, I'm very excited about some of the early research showing some great benefit for digestive disturbances and possibly even stem cell regeneration of new healthy brain cells, neurological pathways. This concept of neurogenesis certainly would be the veritable fountain of youth if this can be proven out in humans. It's already been proven out in rats and laboratory setting, but certainly I'm quite excited about some of the future once we're able to more study these minor cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to misspeak when I say this, but I've also read some studies that have said that CBG could potentially reduce cancer cell growth. And I don't know if you've heard much about that or not.
There has been some early research on this. Many post-chemotherapy patients are using cannabis to help control a lot of symptoms. But there has been some early what's called Petri dish model research, mostly on CBD, showing that it interferes with, unfortunately, lead to the metastasis or the spreading of cancer. And even the defective gene, I believe Dr. Sean McAllister has shown that CBD helps to inactivate or reverse the spread of metastatic cancer by affecting this ID1 gene, which seems to be the culprit when the gene turns defective. And it's able to switch off that defect in the gene, making it more normal. And certainly, there's a long way to go before a drug is potentially developed, maybe 10 to 20 years down the road. But certainly the early research does show some interesting benefit. Of course, many patients who are using CBD to help overcome health challenges are certainly reporting some very interesting success in many cases.
It's amazing. Wow. And so exciting. I mean, we've said this so many times on the podcast that we're just scratching the surface because there's over 150 cannabinoids included in the plant, right? And we've only kind of discovered the like 10.
For sure, there certainly, and then you have a lot of other plant material. Your terpenes are very well studied now with essential oils, but the flavonoids, particularly certain flavonoids that are particular to the cannabis plant, B, caneoflavin C, have all shown like 30 times the anti-inflammatory properties of aspirin. And I can't wait till we get enough quantity of these flavonoids in commercial production so we can start to utilize those and have some anecdotal feedback from people who are using products, and potentially that'll help us to develop better dietary supplements or better pharmaceutical products to help address the needs of individuals.
We talk a lot about cannabinoids and terpenes on this podcast, but my knowledge of flavonoids is very limited. So for my benefit and for the audience, give us a high level overview of flavonoids and their medicinal properties.
Well, flavonoids might give you the characteristic flavoring, if you will, or the taste. Flavonoids are also what makes blueberries blue or strawberries red. And of course, flavonoids do seem to have some very interesting properties. I believe this enzyme CoQ10 is a part of a flavonoid that certainly has great effect on heart and cardiovascular issues. Certainly, the study and research of flavonoids is more done by what might be called the American Botanical Council, or people who study plants and the beneficial properties of plants. And we are very early in some of the study and research, particularly on the flavonoids in the cannabis plant family. But again, over time, this will come more to the forefront and people will be looking more at the flavonoid profile. Of course, the combination of THC, maybe CBD, and then your terpenes, 2 or 3 main terpenes, are what differentiates all the maybe 200 plus different strains of cannabis. Each one will have a certain terpene profile. That's why you'll smell your bud, if you will, out of the jar at the dispensary, and the bud tender will have you smell this one. You'll have a certain characteristic, say for OG Kush versus sour diesel, et cetera. And these are all because of the terpenes and the different aroma and smell characteristics that the terpenes will confer.
My mouth's not watering, but I'm like doing the equivalent of my nose when you talked about like the dispensary and smelling the different different buds, because it's an experience, and they're all so different, right? Based on their genetics and their strains.
Well, if you say, for example, go to a wine sommelier, for example, someone who's very familiar with good wine and the rest, of course, it's all about the taste and how it hits your palate, if you will. And these are more of the flavonoids in the wine because it gives you the characteristic taste. And different growing regions, of course, will have a different type of grape and a different taste. And similarly, with cannabis, we think this is going to emerge to be somewhat similar. You'll have designer forms of cannabis, if you will. And again, the taste, the flavonoids may start to play a much larger role in the overall picture once we get to the point where you go to a dispensary and you've got things like you have in a liquor store, and you have the different types of wine and different varieties and all the rest. So
Yeah.
certainly that market has been developing for decades and decades. Here, we're still in the prohibition era of cannabis versus when alcohol prohibition ended back in the 1930s. But it's also interesting to note that just like cannabis, before the prohibition, there was a whole medical sector, and there used to be medicinal alcohol as well that was doctor prescribed.
Right. Yeah. We are living in such a unique time in terms of, the end of the prohibition era. Right. And it's exciting. And there's one thing I want to touch on. I'm going to kind of flip the switch here, but I want to get your thoughts on this. And it's the psychedelic realm. So we know that Colorado has passed psilocybin treatment for like, addiction, depression, and we just saw that Oregon did as well. So tell us a little bit about this from a science perspective, the benefits of microdosing, say, psilocybin for different, different types of depression or addiction or any type of other elements that you can address.
Very, very excited about the emergence of this psychedelics arena. Certainly, it's been Schedule 1 compound with supposedly no medicinal use, but researchers who study mental health and have gotten to their wits' end trying to help many depression and other patients, even traumatic head injury patients with athletes, are finding tremendous benefit with psychedelics, and particularly in some of the lower doses, what they call microdoses. It's helping alleviate and clear up tremendous issues with individuals. And many times it's just one episode or one dose, if you will, has a huge effect to open up different neurological pathways and change a person's entire outlook. Instead of becoming depressed and suicidal, they're upbeat, happy, and more able to normally interact in society. So these things are.
And because of that effect, is it due to the chemical compounds within the fungi of the psilocybin, or is it that spiritual experience where it's like this is mind blowing, this is this is life changing?
Well, certainly there are both aspects to it, I believe. Many individuals go on this long journey. Many will go down to the Amazon region of Brazil and have these shaman take them through, say, a week-long spiritual experience using high amounts of ayahuasca and come back just totally changed individuals. Other individuals just go to an experienced practitioner, and now many doctors in the country of Canada are becoming much more into the psychedelics arena as certain restrictions have been lifted. And now if you're a terminally ill patient, for example, you can get use of psychedelic therapy. I believe the first 4 patients in Canada were just treated this fall. But I've also seen many very well-known professional sport athletes with traumatic head injury, concussion, hockey, football players, etc., who the repeated head injury is just, unfortunately, just destroyed normal electrical circuits within the brain and driving them right to the brink of suicide. And just one treatment with psychedelics and the proper dosing opens up certain receptor sites, particularly these serotonin receptor site, very technically the 5-HT2A receptor, which again just confers feelings of well-being, happiness to individuals. And certainly there is some real science to it that many doctors are now coming on board and working with psychedelics companies to develop products, work with clinical study and research to get the dosing just correctly. I couldn't be more excited about the emergence of this sector. It doesn't really have the same stigma that the cannabis sector does. The cannabis sector's got the hippie smoking a joint, that sort of thing. But certainly when you see these well-experienced healthcare professionals and mental health coming on board with psychedelics, I just have to believe this is a tremendous growth sector, and it fits very well with certain forms of cannabis. Say your CBD, for example, hits the 5-HT1A receptor, which is also a serotonin receptor. So the combination of CBD and psilocybin may be ideal for many mental health or depression patients, and hopefully we can start to really help people rather than just manage symptoms.
Mm-hmm. You brought up a really interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, and that's the stigma attached to psychedelics compared to the stigma attached to cannabis. And I would think that the stigma would be more for psychedelics, just because it's a much more radical experience as opposed to just like smoking a joint of marijuana or THC. But you're right. I mean, there is more stigma attached to the cannabis plant than, and there, it seems like there's more credibility or legitimacy on the psychedelic side, at least from a, a healthcare perspective, you know.
Well, I mean, if it's going to take us this huge amount of time to get over the cannabis hurdle, of course, we have many medical doctors now recommending cannabis because they're seeing it work so well for their, patients. And we had legalization in cannabis here in California, where I'm coming to you today from, back in 1996. And here it is, 2020, and we still don't have national regulations, if you will. But I believe with these psychedelics arena, they're on a much, much faster track, certainly with individuals who are just searching, especially with today's stress in society and all the pressures with the COVID situation. That's just accentuating this to a much greater degree. Doctors are searching for answers because they're only able to help their patients so much with the current medicines that they have in their arsenal. But now with the psychedelics, all of a sudden, this is opening up a whole new paradigm in the mental health and psychology arenas that, my gosh, these individuals, these doctors are just coming totally on board and saying, where can I get more information? How can I work to help dose people? And these individuals taking micro doses of psychedelics where you don't necessarily have this huge ayahuasca experience, but still the microdosing has really helped a tremendous amount of people and individuals. And I think that's where the doctors are really coming on board, because this could be more of something that fits into their medicine cabinet versus having to go on this spiritual shamanistic ritual. And maybe that's quite beneficial for many individuals, but it's not necessarily something a medical doctor might want to become involved with without having a lot of study and experience in that arena.
Sure. But I agree with you. I mean, it makes so much sense. It seems like more of a solution as opposed to like a pain management or just a management problem, right?
Right.
I've
Yes.
had a friend on, Stephen Gottlieb, on the podcast, and um, he talked about his experience battling opioid addiction and how he turned to ibogaine clinics in Mexico. And the way he described iboga, or ibogaine practice, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but at a high level, basically he had eroded the opioid receptors in his brain. So iboga naturally kind of fills those holes back up. So it addresses things like addiction and depression and other things. And he went he was a firm believer, and now he's an advocate of it. You know what I mean? And he's always encouraging people that are battling the same things to go to those Mexican clinics and go try it.
Right. Yes, there was a very interesting study done on St. Kitts. I believe a group out of Germany called Demorex had a study of about 200 patients with ibogaine, and the results were phenomenal as far as overcoming chronic pain, other traumatic head injury type situations, and certainly addiction to all the painkillers, opioids, etc. So yes, there's a tremendous effect that these psychedelics do have on the body and on the brain, and it's just a question of trying to dose it correctly. Each one of us has a different individual body chemistry, so I'm going to respond to something differently than you might respond. But if you can dial it in just correctly, and I think that's really the future here in terms of not only cannabis medicine but also these psychedelics. It's just personalizing medicine to meet your specific needs.
Hmm.
Certainly with cannabis, you have all these chemical compounds, THC, CBD, and you can just adjust and try to dial in the perfect combination. And I'm sure this is going to happen with the psychedelics industry as well. I couldn't be more excited about it. There are a great number of companies raising a good amount of investor dollars so that they can do clinical study and research. Certainly think that this is a wonderful industry that really can just totally change and transform the way we look at healthcare. Certainly 200 years ago, all our doctors were plant botanists because their medicine came from plants. And though we've gotten away from that paradigm, it's interesting that certainly cannabis and these psychedelics are taking us back in that route.
Yeah. And to play off of that, you always go back to your roots, right? Eventually. So,
I think so. It's really interesting. If you study mushrooms, there's a very interesting form of interconnectivity underneath the ground. The mushrooms tend to have this far-reaching branching type effect where they communicate with other plants, trees, and all the rest. And when the mushroom kind of comes up through the ground and able to, energy or get the energy from the universe, if you will, channeling that down into the soil. It's very, very interesting what's really happening at that scientific level. I'm sure at some point there'll be some very, very interesting research about the mushrooms and how they're really balancing, if you will, the plant abilities on the plant, or taking information from us humans that goes into the soil, and then our plants tend to adjust some of the compounds that are in the plant itself. Very interesting. If you look at some ancient Chinese history, you'll see if you live in one place for 3 years or longer, outside your home, the plants will have everything you need to heal yourself.
wow.
Just the way us humans and plants interact. And
Right.
I'm certainly very interested in this etheric concept of how humans, and particularly the cannabis plant, interacts with changes in our human society. And now this COVID thing being so prominent, it's been interesting to see that CBD has now been used for its anti-inflammatory properties, and potentially the whole cannabis genomic sequence might shift just a little bit in response to what's going on with the COVID situation on the planet.
Right. Yeah. And it's I mean, I'm really interested to learn more about this in the coming years as we focus more on alternative plant medicine. And the way you describe the mushrooms roots going down and talking to the trees and whatnot, if you were to tell me that at first without explaining the science behind it, I'd say, Dr. Titus, you were on a psilocybin trip and you were, in the woods somewhere. But I mean, they're magical things, right? Plants are incredible, especially the cannabis plant, which virtually has no waste.
For sure, it's absolutely amazing. And the mushrooms, they have this what's called mycorrhizal network. I believe I'm trying to pronounce it properly, and I need to go to botany school to understand it better. But certainly your listeners might be able to look that up. This mushroom mycorrhizal network that exists underground, and it just reaches out to all the trees and bushes and all the other plant varieties, and the communication that happens between the plants themselves. A very, very interesting field of study.
Wow. That is some next level stuff. Yeah, I can't wait to learn more about that. Thanks for touching on the psychedelic space. Really appreciate the insights there. So let's talk about your company, Medical Marijuana. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, first ever publicly traded cannabis company in the U.S. So tell us a little bit about your operations and what all you do.
Medical Marijuana Inc. Was formed, and the first public company, as you mentioned, back in March of 2009. Our ticker symbol for those investors is MJNA. We really transformed in 2011 with a new group that came in, bought the company in March of 2011, 2 years after our inception. And they've been focused on hemp and CBD, and really wanting to bring the first nutraceutical form of CBD as a dietary supplement, if you will, to U.S. and world markets, because we thought that the non-psychoactive cannabinoids could be taken in much larger quantities to where you could actually really supplement this internal endogenous cannabinoid system. And of course, we'd seen the research from Dr. Rousseau. Many of us are cannabinoid deficient. And of course, you smoke a cannabis joint, maybe you get a couple of milligrams worth of THC, and certainly there's effect there. But if you could take 50 or 100 milligrams of a non-psychoactive form, say CBD, certainly U.S. government research had shown the benefit of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids as being preferable to use, because again, you can give much larger doses without any negative intoxicating side effects. So we thought individuals could maybe take 50 milligrams of CBD in the morning. They could drive to work. They could do their daily activities without any negative effects. They could operate heavy machinery, etc., and potentially move to much higher levels of overall health and wellness. We thought that these essential nutrients in cannabis, and particularly CBD, could potentially rival vitamin C for their importance. And of course, here it is now, nearly 10 years later, and it's certainly been proven out by the popularity of CBD throughout the world. We've been very fortunate to be on the cutting edge of developing this non-psychoactive cannabis market. Certainly we had challenges when it was first developed, but it came from virtually non-existent in the year 2011, our first sales in the spring of 2012, and it's grown by leaps and bounds ever since. We've been fortunate to legalize our products in the country of Brazil in April of 2014, where they're only available by doctor prescription. Similarly, in Mexico in February of 2016, where we had to develop a fully THC devoid or THC free form of our CBD products to be accepted in the country. Back at the time, they had all the war on drugs, the cartel violence, and terrible things happening with the THC side. So the regulatory authority in Mexico could see the benefit of CBD, but were so THC adverse that was what we had to do. We went to our laboratories, developed this particular product, and it's been so successful in the country of Mexico that it's really led to this evolution now to where they're looking to legalize cannabis. Certainly, it looks like they're going to have this passed through the House of Representatives. The Senate's already passed their version, and certainly go to the president to sign into law. Maybe the regulations won't take effect for 6 months or so, but we believe this is going to be the largest cannabis market in the world. And we're very excited that we've been selling CBD products there since February of 2016. I think the acceptance that the communities had, the medical professionals are on board with it. Many parents are seeing great benefit with their children with epileptic seizure disorders and other health challenges for these young children. And it's not being abused. And the regulatory authorities in Mexico are saying, oh, okay, well, gosh, we can now see a pathway for cannabis and THC to be allowed. So certainly the movement of evolution has kind of gone that way. And besides that, we've now developed operations through one of our other divisions, a marketing group called Cannaway, which is a direct sales company. Now we're marketing products since 2017 into the European community, and have recently launched in the country of Japan and doing very, very well over there. So certainly people around the globe are now getting the opportunity to experience the health and wellness benefits of non-psychoactive forms of cannabis. And we couldn't be more excited about the fact that the world has really been accepting of these new types of cannabis that have been introduced to the world over the past 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm. And, I can relate being in the non-psychoactive cannabis space, being in Texas, right? I have my own brokerage company, Cannabinoid Nation. We represent a handful of farmers here. And I'm bringing this up because in you being in the same space, have you experienced challenges with the lack of consumer oversight from the FDA? I know that when we first started the podcast, you touched on how you testified to the FDA last year, right? In their congressional hearing. So how has that affected Medical Marijuana Inc.'s operations?
Well, we've tried to be a little bit ahead of the curve. Certainly, the FDA and regulatory authorities, we believe, will certainly be looking more and more intently at the marketplace as it starts to evolve and develop. So we, kind of developed our own internal triple lab testing procedures going way back to 2014, well ahead of anything that'll be mandated upon the industry. And certainly, testing in the cannabis industry is very important. Canada, you've got some very strict testing regulations in terms of pesticides that are used, for example, in various forms of indoor cannabis grow. And so many of these pesticides are normally just fine as agricultural chemicals that go into our bodies and certainly don't seem to have harmful characteristics, but all of a sudden, these same pesticides in the cannabis space, if you start to heat them and smoke them, all of a sudden become extremely toxic. So Health Canada has now maintained a part per billion um, limit on some of the pesticides, for example. But getting back to the FDA, certainly this is something that's a little bit new to them. They don't quite understand the CBD craze, as they call it, but obviously people are seeing some great benefit with their overall health and wellness by using these natural botanical forms. The FDA, of course, is trying to cater to the pharmaceutical side. And then the FDA, in terms of CBD, well, the only research they have is on Epidiolex, the drug version, which again, as I mentioned earlier, has these toxic liver side effects, elevating toxic liver enzymes such as ALT, AST, and ALP. We don't see that with the natural botanical form of cannabis, and particularly CBD. So we're having to prove this to the FDA. And, of course, the FDA is trying to put up other challenges and roadblocks. They're not wanting to carve out a dietary supplement pathway for CBD because they already have it as a drug, but certainly we believe both can equally peacefully coexist. And it now seems that Congress is taking the bull by the horns, and there's a bill in Congress to actually carve out this pathway for CBD to be allowed as both a dietary supplement as well as a food ingredient. So that will certainly change the paradigm and allow for more of the large storefronts, the Whole Foods and other health food stores of the world, to start to carry much more in the way of CBD-based products, which are things that consumers are really looking for. They have to, unfortunately, in some cases, go online to try to buy it, but they can't interact with another human to get the education that they want, or they want to learn to, perhaps get the right serving size for themselves. Well, that information is not as readily available as it should be, unfortunately, but we're working to change all that.
Right. Yeah, we want it in Whole Foods. The people want it in Whole Foods. They want the information about how to properly dose and whatnot, but also they want a high quality product also, right? I mean, the lack of consumer oversight has kind of led to more snake oil, more products that contain little to even no CBD, right? So those are factors also that I think would be so beneficial, not only to the consumer, but of course to the industry, the people that are actually trying to do the right thing,
For sure, yes. And there are now divisions in the regulatory authority that are working with various cannabis groups, in particular the testing laboratory facilities, to all get everyone on an equal playing field. This American Chemical Society and some of the other groups to, come in to make sure that, if you have a cannabis-based product, a CBD or THC product in California, and you take the same product over to Connecticut, that it's going to test out for the same levels, and that there's more standardization in the testing arena. Of course, that's going to move us all to a higher level of professionalism. I wouldn't necessarily say it's going to get us all up to pharmaceutical standards. We might not want to be quite that pure, but at least to good high-level dietary supplement standards, where we can maintain a very good quality and consumers can be assured that this product is safe. It's not laced with any foreign ingredients or something that you might find in the black market that could have some detrimental effects for you.
It's so encouraging that the American Clinical Association, as you mentioned, is doing that. Because I've had guests on where they've talked about this concept of lab shopping, right? Where they're going to a certain lab to get guaranteed test results that don't always add up to what they're really producing. So that's a huge problem. And so it's good that they're doing that. So Dr. Titus, what else should we talk about? I mean, what does the future, look like in terms of CBD regulation or just the cannabis industry as a whole?
Well, I'm quite excited. Again, Congress taking up some of these bills now to do what many U.S. states have individually done. Let's carve out a nice pathway for CBD to be sold as a dietary supplement as well as a food ingredient. Certainly, we're happy to see that the will of the people, if you will, is being met through our congressional representatives. Cannabis industry itself, my gosh, we're right on the precipice of legalization, right on the precipice of a United Nations vote to potentially deschedule, take cannabis off these convention treaties on narcotics. Certainly, we're looking at the psychedelics arena coming into full play now, and we really believe that decriminalization and certainly this has a tremendous benefit for individuals. We might start to see some of the health food stores being able to sell micro doses of psychedelics, if you will, that you wouldn't necessarily need to be sick and a patient to go get a doctor's prescription to be able to use it. Though, of course, it's always wonderful to have a trained practitioner experience to help guide some of us. I think the professionalism is moving along quite nicely. They're now continuing medical education symposiums for doctors to get more information on cannabis, cannabinoids, so that's quite exciting. The European community is moving forward now with this novel food regulation on CBD, certainly, and certainly the European community, European Commission, very much in favor of cannabis, as we're certainly seeing countries such as Germany, one of the largest cannabis markets in the world, many patients getting medical insurance reimbursement for their cannabis-based recommendations from doctors. So really this trend throughout the globe, tremendous movement here. I think if I can quote Dr. McCollum and some of his work, he said, once we've researched out the full cannabis plant, it's probably going to replace about 40% of all pharmaceutical medications.
And let's hope it does, because what we're doing right now, it doesn't seem to be working. It seems to be management, but no real solution, So, hey, that's a great way to end it, Dr. Titus. I really appreciate your time today and your brilliant insights. I know that myself, I benefited from it, but I know that the audience did as well. I have reached out to the FDA to see if someone would want to come on. And if they would be open to it, maybe I'd have someone like you on and, not have a debate format, but just kind of a back and forth exchange where we're opening up dialogue about this. And with your level of expertise, I'd love to have you on to represent, the industry. So if you'd be open to that, we can definitely get in touch.
Well, I'd love to do it. I've previously testified before the FDA, just mentioning that really these non-psychoactive cannabinoids in particular really are essential nutrients, and they really should be dietary supplements. And we should have that available for people to utilize across the country. Certainly, if you're sick and a patient, you get the pharmaceutical form, and it's helped to many families and their challenged children. But certainly for people to utilize a nice, safe, regulated product that would be considered a dietary supplement, have this available for individuals to improve levels of health and wellness. I couldn't think of anything greater. I'd absolutely love to come on board and help with any dialogue or debate with the FDA as necessary. We think they've been dragging their feet a little bit. They could be a little bit more proactive. Certainly, when you look at the tremendous number of people using CBD products now, population, the senior citizens, and many of them have gone from trial use, one serving a day, up to now maybe they're 3-4 servings a day using different products, different topical application versus ingestible, etc. The growth has really been exceptional, and we see these trends just continuing. We'd love to get the FDA more on board on the cannabis, the overall THC debate as well. At some point, they're going to potentially be regulating this unless we pick a cannabis czar and have this all regulated separately, which I'd love to actually have. But nonetheless, some of us in the cannabis industry may be dealing with some of the issues that us in the CBD industry are dealing with currently in the future, if it works out that way. So to get the FDA more on board on cannabis and to see some of the benefit with study and research, I think would be fabulous. In the CBD industry, we're already doing a small study right now with some individuals just to prove that we don't elevate the toxic liver enzyme levels like Epidiolex does. So that's one step of many down this pathway, but certainly we've undertaken this within our industry, and certainly we look forward to further debate and dialogue with the FDA on the legalization of cannabis as it occurs.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I will definitely keep you updated as to how that all plays out. I just got in touch with them this week. So,
Fabulous. Wonderful.
but yeah, no, again, really appreciate your time, Dr. Titus. And before we go, where can people find Medical Marijuana Inc.? So your websites or any kind of social media information, if you know it on hand.
Yes, surely. Our website, medicalmarijuanainc.com, just all spelled out. And some of our sales companies' websites, Hemp Meds is one of our divisions, Hemp Meds, HEMP, PX.com. Another one of our divisions, Kannaway, KANNAWAY, Kannaway.com. Certainly, we're excited about some of the great things going on with those divisions. And then we have investments in two up-and-coming biotech, biopharmaceutical companies. One, which was formerly known as Canalife Inc., now is known as Neuropathics, NPTX, on the over-the-counter markets. And the other one, Axim Biotechnologies, AXIM, on the OTC markets.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Titus, and thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye, guys.